The town of Hawthorn Hollow was small, tucked away among dark forests and rolling hills, a place where people knew each other's names and whispered about the strange events that occasionally stirred their quiet lives. But it was peaceful, too, at least, until that fateful night. As the clock struck midnight, a thick fog began to creep over the town. The moon, obscured by heavy clouds, left the streets submerged in a deep, unnatural darkness. The wind was still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. And then, the shadows began to move. At first, there were only whispers. A creaking door here, a shiver down the spine there, but then the shadows grew, undulating like living things. They slid along walls, stretched across rooftops, and slithered through windows. But none saw them yet. The people of Hawthorn Hollow slept on, unaware of the nightmare coming to life in the streets. Then, they came for the town. The first scream tore through the night, sharp, strangled, and broken. A figure darted past a window, blood splattering across the glass. A moment later, silence fell once more. And when the sun finally rose, no one came out of their homes. A search party was dispatched by a nearby town, drawn in by the lack of response, the eerie stillness of the morning. They arrived to find the streets eerily vacant, no sounds except for the faint rustle of leaves. As they entered the town center, a cold shiver of dread washed over them, for the sight before them was worse than they could have imagined. Bodies lay strewn about, their twisted forms a testament to the horror that had unfolded. Blood pooled in the streets, dripping from shattered windows and cracked doors. The stench of death was thick, choking the air. Eyes stared blankly from their faces, frozen in expressions of terror, mouths agape and silent screams that would never be heard. The homes were the same. Broken doors, toppled furniture, and pools of crimson. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where the monsters had come from. It was as though the entire town had been picked apart in a matter of minutes, the streets left drenched in the aftermath. And then they saw her. At the center of the town, sitting motionless in a circle of bodies, was a young woman. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, her clothes soaked in blood, as though she had been bathed in it. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her body trembling, yet utterly still. Her gaze was distant, lost in something the search party couldn't comprehend. She was covered in blood, thick, dark, congealed, and yet there was no sign of injury on her body. "Help me!" Someone muttered as they knelt beside her, their voice trembling. But she didn't respond. The woman did not speak, did not move, and there was something unnerving about her stillness. As they tried to coax her away, gently lifting her from the ground, they saw the bloodstains on the pavement, outlining her body where she had sat. They hesitated, confusion clouding their thoughts. They guided her away from the epicenter of the chaos, attempting to shield her from the horror, but as they walked, the ground beneath their feet began to soften, like the earth itself was trying to reject them. The woman didn't seem to notice. Her eyes remained blank, fixed on nothing. She was the perfect picture of fear and fragility, as if she had been robbed of her will to live. But there was something wrong, something that didn't quite fit. As they neared the outskirts of the town, the air began to shift again. It was subtle at first, like a faint vibration beneath their feet. A barely perceptible flicker in the shadows. They stopped, turning, their gazes drawn to the trees at the edge of the town. It felt as if the shadows themselves were watching, waiting. Then, as they led the young woman down a quiet street, a strange sensation filled the air, a sudden weight, as if something were looming just beyond their vision. They turned back to the woman. Her eyes, wide and lifeless, shifted just slightly. It was the only movement she'd made. As they walked, they began to notice something else, the faint, almost imperceptible whispers in the air, like a breeze brushing against their ears, or a thought crossing their minds. It felt wrong. The shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally toward them. The woman's bloodied hands twitched once more. But her face remained vacant. They could hear it now, footsteps in the distance, but there was no one to be seen. Their breath quickened, and an unsettling feeling crept up their spines. The young woman, her skin cold, still hadn't said a word. Her catatonia was beginning to look more like an act. And that was when they saw it, the shape that should not have been there. A long, serpentine shadow stretching impossibly far in the morning light, slithering behind her as though it were part of her. The search party halted, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go still. The air grew thick, the ground beneath them heavy. But the woman was no longer still. Her lips curled, the barest hint of a smile flickering across her face. It was cold, empty, and it sent a wave of terror through the group. Her hands, which had been trembling, now gripped the blood-stained ground tightly, her fingers digging into the earth with unnatural strength. One of the search party members stepped forward, calling her name. She tilted her head slowly, the smile still playing at the corners of her lips. Her eyes, previously wide and empty, now glinted with something darker, something far more sinister. A low, guttural sound filled the air, barely a whisper, but enough to freeze their blood. It was a voice, one that didn't belong to any human. With a sudden motion, the woman rose to her feet. The bloodstains on her clothes didn't seem to faze her anymore. She stood taller now, her posture straight and commanding, the fear she had been projecting evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The shadows, once distant, rippled behind her, growing darker, thicker, swirling around her like a cloak of night. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the monsters, those who had slaughtered the entire town, began to take form, emerging from the very shadows she had summoned. The truth settled in with a sickening clarity, she had been the one who had brought them here. The search party froze in terror as the first of the creatures emerged, massive, dark forms, shaped like elongated figures with glowing eyes and twisted limbs, their bodies moving with unnatural fluidity. They were hers. They had always been hers. The woman's smile widened. The creatures, once terrifyingly feral, were now silent, obedient, waiting for her command. As the search party turned to flee, their minds reeling from the revelation, the woman stood still, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The last remnants of Hawthorn Hollow had been obliterated, and she had guided the way. She wasn't a victim, she was the cause. She had wanted this. And as the monsters closed in behind her, their shadows stretching far and wide, it was clear, the nightmare wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The woman's eyes, once blank, now gleamed with an eerie, unholy joy. She had called them. And they had answered. And soon, she would summon more.